Welcome to this first edition of our lecture series, Critical Heritage Studies at Arqus. My name is Steffi Marung. I'm from the Global and European Studies Institute at Leipzig University, and as one of the co-organizers of this lecture series, it's a great pleasure to me, for me to welcome you as the audience on YouTube, but most importantly also to welcome our distinguished speaker of today. Heritage studies, as you might know, and as you might experience yourself in your academic life, is a very diverse field that draws on the experience of a number of disciplines and professionals. These include anthropologists, archaeologists, archivists, librarians, museum studies and cultural studies, but also historians and architects and scholars from the spatial humanities, as well as urban and tourism studies. The concept of cultural heritage is not confined to material objects, such as paintings or manuscripts or monuments or archaeological sites, but it also encompasses oral tradition, artistic expressions, ceremonial practices, cultural landscapes, and natural science. This diversity gives rise to a range of approaches in research and teaching, as well as divergent conceptualizations of the nature of cultural heritage and its function in the formation of collective memories and identities, and particularly also in the process of constructing Europe. The very notion of Europe and the European project more broadly in a global context is inextricably linked to the creation, conservation, and contestation of its cultural heritage. It played a particularly prominent role in the legitimation of European empires and nation-states since the 19th century, and it came to be seen as a crucial fundament for what would become the ambitious European integration project after the Second World War. In recent decades, postcolonial critiques of the appropriation of cultural objects from former colonial territories have also provoked major debates about European heritage. The end of authoritarian regimes in Southern Europe and the profound transformations in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall marked another major turning point in the reflection on European heritage in this post-authoritarian moment. The complex migrations and mobilities by which European societies came to be shaped since decades have furthermore complicated our understanding of what European heritage is about. And the rise of populist nationalism across Europe in recent decades additionally challenged perceptions of cultural heritage. Finally, also the serious implications of the climate crisis and the unprecedented nature of the digital revolution have raised a number of new questions for heritage studies. The Arqus Alliance combines this diversity of experiences and change across the European continent in a unique way, and it hosts a number of centers of excellence for the study of European heritage. So this lecture series provides a unique forum for the reflection of this diversity of approaches and also marks a starting point for the mapping for the further development of Arqus's contribution to critical heritage studies. And finally, also offers a platform for exchange with stakeholders in the field, including museums, archives, and educational institutions. In that context, it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce you the speaker of tonight, Professor Marija Drėmaitė from Vilnius University. She's a renowned expert in the field of heritage studies, and she has engaged with a number of the questions that I just raised in my introduction. Marija is Professor of Architectural History and Cultural Heritage at Vilnius University, and their expertise focuses on 20th century architectural heritage, with her research interests encompassing the history and heritage of architecture, industrial culture, and heritage and cultural history of modernity. She completed her PhD at the Vilnius Academy of Arts and held postdoctoral and research fellowships at Vilnius University, the University of Helsinki, the Estonian Academy of Arts, the Royal College of Art in London, and also in Leipzig at the Center for the History and Culture of East Central Europe. She has an impressive career, not only as a researcher, but also as a, I would say, heritage activist. She held positions as the Secretary General for the Lithuanian National Commission for UNESCO and served as a scientific board member of the EU Joint Programming Initiative Cultural Heritage and Global Change. Additionally, she is currently advisory board member at the Center for Advanced Study in Heritage and Transformation at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and principal investigator of the Memory and Heritage Research Group at the Vilnius University Advanced Research Center Post-Authoritarian Landscapes. She has also led the research team which was behind the successful nomination of the Modernist Kaunas project, which is inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2023. Marija has published widely on the questions of her empirical research. I want just to mention her 2017 book, Baltic Modernism, Architecture and Housing in Soviet Lithuania, as well as the 2018 volume, Architecture of Optimism, the Kaunas, 1918 to 1940. So that's a further read into Marija's expertise. In her lecture, Marija will explore the evolving legacy of post-war architectural modernism in Lithuania, focusing also on the transformation of Soviet-era buildings and urban landscapes since the country's 1919 Declaration of Independence. So focusing on this particular Eastern European post-authoritarian moment. She will also look into the changing societal perceptions and challenges of recognition and the role of collective memory in shaping attitudes towards this dissonant heritage. So Marija, now I provide the floor to you, and I'm looking very much forward to the lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Steffi, really so much for nice introduction. And I would like to thank Arqus Alliance that we have such an interesting living lab which focuses on the questions of European identity and heritage. And I think that dissonant heritage as a topic is extremely relevant for the European identity, because the countries in Europe had so many conflicting, discussed agreements and different discussions around the heritage that we really need to understand that the heritage can only be not only consonant, very sound, but also dissonant. And in this lecture, we can we can discuss what we can learn from the dissonant heritage theory and the dissonant heritage approach. Because even if plurality and awareness are today part of heritage discourses, there are monuments, intangible assets, and memories which still remain difficult to manage and deserve special attention. The history of Europe has generated a heritage that sometimes is controversial and complex due to belonging of totalitarian regimes or contextual borders. This heritage has been called dissonant, addressing the problematic link between the physical elements like architecture, neighborhoods, monuments, landscapes, and urban public spaces, and the historical and political values those elements represent. And I would like to turn your attention to the seminal book by Turnbridge and Ashworth, published in 1996, where they tell that even if a certain degree of dissonance is implicit in the nature of heritage itself in general, there are monuments, practices, and memories which deserve specific attention due to the origin and features of their dissonance. In their view, dissonance can be considered as an attribute of place which is dependent of its past, plus the existence of conflicting communities or heritage users. They list three main sources of dissonance: dissonance implicit in commodification, dissonance implicit in place products, and dissonance implicit in the content of the message. And I will focus in my lesson in this third, mainly on this third content of the message, and would like to state the main thesis from the book of Tunbridge and Ashworth, where they notice that both in history and in heritage practice, the past is selected based on the needs and uses of the present, and the past is transformed through interpretation. It's interesting that physical form of an object may remain completely unchanged, but its interpretation may change radically. And therefore, I chose to use the example of interpretation of the Baltic heritage, particularly Lithuanian modernist heritage, and most examples will be from Vilnius. And for this, here I'm using the Arqus Alliance map of Europe. You can see the Vilnius, Lithuania and Vilnius are most north. But this transformation from the western periphery of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet West, as the Baltics were called, to the contemporary eastern periphery of the European Union, or the title Eastern Europe that was gained after 1990 when the independence of the Baltic states was declared, actually invites for review, observation, and discussion of how the heritage and the legacy of the socialist era was interpreted during the last 35 years of independent life. And I will rely, of course, a little bit of my book, Baltic Modernism, Architecture and Housing in Soviet Lithuania, that was already presented nicely by Steffi. But I also posed the question, why this interpretation changes? How did it change? And what was this concept of the Soviet West in architecture and design? I would like to cite the quotation from the famous Soviet-Russian journalist Yuri Gerchuk, which he reminded in the book published in 2000 about style and socialism, modernity and material culture in post-war Eastern Europe. And the quotation sounds like this: "The Baltic republics actively contributed to the transformation of the aesthetic milieu of Soviet everyday life and to formation of the new style. Annexed to the Soviet Union only in the eve of the Second World War, the Baltic republics had little time to submit to official culture's equalization policies, and during the Khrushchevian thaw, recovered more quickly than those regions that had been Soviet from the start. For us, products from the Baltic bore the unmistakable stamp of the European culture we so desired." And this perception of the Soviet West, that the Baltic republics were Sovietized, but not to the very end, not completely, will serve as a primal basic thesis that we will try to interpret, to look at how it was formed. And I structured the lecture in two parts. In the first part, I would like to explain the stages and general logic of the Lithuanian modernism of the 60s to 80s, connection to the local context, discourses and techniques, center-periphery relations, adapted, rejected, or rejected ideas which originated in the metropolis, in Moscow, and in capitals of other republics of the USSR, and in other local modernisms of the world. And in the part 2, we will discuss evolution of attitudes toward modernist heritage after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the typology of buildings, and the theory of two socialist modernisms, prevailing policies regarding modernist heritage, destruction, preservation, transformation, and examples of successful preservation, and examples of contemporary uses of modernist buildings, including their reinterpretation. So what did Yuri Gerchuk had in mind when he wrote that Baltic republics joined or actually didn't join, but were annexed to the Soviet Union only in the 1940, in the eve of the Second World War? For Lithuania, it was the very rich legacy of the nation-state, Republic of Lithuania, and its provisional capital Kaunas, which was a phenomenal city because due to this very unique status of the provisional capital in the interwar Europe, it had the task to build a modern capital in Kaunas, the second city of Lithuania, because of the territorial conflicts of the post-imperial collapse, post-World War I Versailles Treaty. The border issue between Poland and Lithuania was very difficultly solved, and Poland annexed Vilnius and Vilnius region in 1920. So unexpectedly, Kaunas became the provisional capital, and it produced a phenomenon of modern architecture and urban planning, which resulted that in 2023, modernist Kaunas as a piece of urban heritage was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, which means, in my case, that Lithuania had already a rich modern architectural heritage and a national school of modernist architects. After the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and after the division of Europe and annexation of occupation and annexation of the Baltic states to Soviet Union in 1940, June 15, of course, it all changed. And we can see that Sovietization of architecture was also an important task, producing especially in the post-war period, the reconstruction, synchronization, new ideological center, and modernization of the old towns in general, but for Vilnius in particular, because Vilnius was given back to Lithuania and was now declared the capital of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. We can see several designs for the main square in Vilnius, which was named the Lenin Square eventually, and with different reorganization and plans. In particularly, I am interested in the term or in the concept of synchronization, which means that all Soviet capitals of the Soviet republics, had to be both recognizable because of the certain set of state buildings, and recognizable as a very hierarchical urban planning, which place is the main place, which had to replicate the main squares in the in the capital city of the Soviet Union, meaning Moscow. And the urban reconstruction of Moscow in 1935 dictated practically all the methods how modern urban capitals must be planned or replanned. And the war destructions of war were used as a very practical means for this replanning, reorganizing, and rebuilding. Also, the change of power, the death of Stalin in 1953, produced the new ideas within the Communist Party with the new leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, who was also interested in, and we wouldn't say even interested, but he has obliged to solve economical problems of the country, which one of them was important reform in construction and architecture. Of course, the main goal was construction, cheaper, faster, and more apartments, industrialization, standardization, and economics of construction. But it also resulted in the turn of the architectural aesthetics concept back to functionalism, back to contemporary style, in which we can see that in the Baltic states, the reaction of this reform was welcoming. And we can see 3 stages of the Lithuanian modernism, which restarted after this post-war decade in 59, and the decade of the 60s was restart of the Lithuanian School of Modernism. The decade of the 70s was the triumph of modernism, because all the most important public buildings were built in Vilnius. And in the last decade of the 80s, postmodernism flourished as a reaction to Soviet standardization. Also, we can see that the rise of local architects, which were actually suppressed in the first post-war decade with the imported leadership from Moscow and Leningrad, was always also given a little bit more power in decision making. But the new generation that was born in the 30s, still in the independent Republic of Lithuania, and graduated in the 50s, made an informal network. And this official course of Khrushchev's industrialization provided the policy of national cadre, which meant that in the national republics, important positions in industry, construction, and management were given to the local population. So the nationality question was important. And this young generation of 30-year-old graduates were giving important positions in architecture. But also we can see the informal values, like group of friends with shared values, professional and social, escaping the Soviet standard, belonging to the international modernism, and maintaining national or regional identity within the modernism. And you can see the picture of the very interesting issue of the Architecture Soviétique of the famous French international modern contemporary architecture journal L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, which issued a special issue dedicated to Soviet architecture. But this journal was not from the library, but from the private archive of one of the architects of this generation I'm referring to. And you can see that on the cover, 3 flags are crossed with a white black pencil and or marker, and these flags are Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, which he said that he wanted to show that we are not Sovietic, and to demonstrate his personal cultural resistance. So if not Sovietic, then what? How they perceive themselves? And it is interesting that because of the political connections and special agreements with Finland and Sweden, those agreements enable that if somebody from the Soviet Union escapes the Soviet Union and wants to stay in Finland, Finland was obliged to return the refugee. Because of the achievements of Finland in modern architecture and especially in modern housing, the trips, architectural trips and study trips to Finland were started to be organized by the Soviet Union Architects Association. And from 59 to 64, it was especially popular among the Lithuanian architects who were taken to the guided tours of full buses of them for 10 days to explore Finland. And in Finland, we can say that especially Alvar Aalto, this regional modernism was some kind of revelation, because it was the first time architects were allowed to travel abroad to the well, we can say it with a certain condition, capitalist country. And also, we can see that the new generation of National Communist Party elites with local aspirations also acted on the benefits of local republics and against the Moscow's centralization. It is called in history institutional nationalism. We can meet such expressions as us and them, manipulation of Moscow, and local communist authorities. And architects, as a part of expert specialist culture, technocratic attitudes, demonstrated technocratic attitude towards architecture, and they gained actually a powerful status of an architect as a professional and the expert, which means that it is not possible to say that only politicians dictated what and how had to be built, but architects gained also a powerful status because of their expert status as an urban planner or as a constructor or as a designer. What is interesting that these architects who on one hand wanted to build buildings that didn't look like Soviet, but merely represented regional modernism of Northern Europe, also were actually very well recognized and established in the later period of socialist Lithuania. Modernist buildings were listed on the monument list of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic already in 1984. 10 architectural monuments were named as local importance, and next year, in 1985, 11 architectural monuments and 4 urban monuments of local importance were added. So we can interpret that on both hands. On one hand, it would be very advanced approach toward modernist architecture, which at that time was not listed usually in European countries because it was too young. It didn't have the time distance enough. It couldn't be evaluated by the next generation. As early as 84 or 85, it was really very avant-garde approach if we look at it purely technically. Just for your attention, the DOCOMOMO, International Organization for Conservation and Research of Modernist Architecture, was only formed in 1988. But on the other hand, the decision was also political. My colleague Viltė Janušauskaitė, a researcher, also read carefully the protocols, the meetings, and all the procedure, how these buildings were selected and listed. And she found out that it was also didactical and political decision to list buildings that would demonstrate the achievements of socialist Lithuania. So the decision was delegated to the Association of Architects, and they themselves had to select what they have built the best during these 40 years of Soviet occupation. Of course, occupation was not mentioned then. What constituted this list? Of course, the greatest achievement by both professionals and politicians was the Lazdynai mass housing residential district built in 1967-73 by famous architects Čekanauskas and Briedikis, because they received Lenin Prize in 1975, the first and the only one in the field of mass housing area design. But also, this was local pride of architects and engineers and builders, because they followed in this planning process and design the Nordic examples, and it was a paradox that in trying to achieve non-Soviet mass housing area, the architects received the prize for the Soviet mass housing design excellence. There were also several urban sites that demonstrated the modern development of Vilnius. For example, the new administrative center with the parliament, the new city center or central business district with shopping and hotel hub, the new student campus Saulėtekis, and the new housing estate Žirmūnai. Also, there were some really national highlights, for example, an art exhibition hall, modernist building inserted into a very sensitive medieval and Baroque old town of Vilnius, which was already protected as cultural heritage site, or the national highlight and a symbol of post-war Lithuanian modernism, interior of the Cafe Neringa by young architects Algimantas and Vytautas Nasvytis, also resembling the cafe culture and design of interwar Lithuanian independent republic. Also, several modernist interiors and buildings, like interior of the Vilnius Central Post Office by the same architects Nasvytis, and academic drama theater interior by the same architects. That these constructions were in the 50s, 60s, and late 70s. Several administrative and cultural buildings from the late 70s and early 80s, and a new building of Vilnius Art Academy in the historic center of Vilnius by Vytautas Briedikis and et al. With postmodernist mentions. But also interesting that multi-story housing, several standardized and specially designed houses for political and cultural elites. So we can see that all types of buildings, all styles, all periods were covered by the famous Lithuanian generation of modernists. The most interesting and intriguing piece was the last inscription, the Šeškinė Public Shopping Center in Vilnius, which was built, completed in 1984 and listed in 1985. So indeed, a unique case in entire Europe, I would say, that in that period, the building is listed after 1 year of its construction. But why this object was interesting? Because it demonstrated completely different approach. You can see that postmodernist approach in the otherwise gray standardized mass housing area of Šeškinė, with presenting the red brick disintegrated mall service and shopping center that had to remind already the historic town, historical architecture, and sort of the old medieval market square. Regardless what it had to remind, it is much more important what the architect of this group, Gediminas Baravykas, said. I quote, "I have to say that in general, the war with the regime of those days, the 80s, was the everyday architecture, or the so-called architecture of the everyday. And ours was such a fight, the effort to bring architecture back into everyday buildings." I think it is important because of the economic reasons. All the public buildings in mass housing areas also had to be built according to standardized design, and this center demonstrated some kind of breakthrough. Finally, in 1987, on August 23, the anti-Soviet meeting in protest against the crimes of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was organized in Vilnius, and we can say that from this date, again, this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was never forgotten, and it affected the nation for so many years. But finally, as a dissident movement, in 1987, it was named not only bad decisions, but the crimes of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that it caused. And from this period, the national liberation movement started to develop in the 1988, 89, and in 1990, on March the 10th, the independence of Lithuania from the Soviet Union was declared. So we can see what it meant in the evolution of attitudes towards modernist heritage after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I deliberately chosen this slide with the monument because usually we understand that it is dissonant heritage are ideological or political monuments. But if we remember what Alois Riegel wrote in 1903, that there are monuments of intention and there are selected monuments from the buildings and sites that were not intentionally built as monuments. So of course the monuments have intention, and demolition and decontextualization of ideological communist monuments happened in all the countries, and we call it the first wave of revisionism, which happened after 1990 and was very clearly orientated towards all the political and ideological monuments. Like we can see that a famous photograph by very famous Lithuanian photographer Antanas Sutkus, "Goodbye Party Comrades," is demolition of the Lenin sculpture in the central square of Vilnius. But also there are the special park for communist monuments was organized in Grutas, where all these monuments were not destroyed and demolished, but they were taken from the representative spaces, places, and environments into the neutral forest, where they lost their power of ideology and now can be observed sometimes with irony, sometimes with despise, but in general, they lost their power. But architecture, especially modernist architecture, is completely different thing. We have seen that in the selection of those monuments, what has to be listed or not, buildings were selected that were not intended as monuments before. They were mostly built for functional uses. So, and they were designed by Lithuanian architects that in the course of events became famous modernist architects. And also they, from the memories, we could interpret that they were in opposition to Soviet design, Soviet rule. We had a very fruitful research decade from 2010 and 22, positioning, discussing Baltic modernism from the Soviet West to the East, North, Central Europe. And how do we position it? Was it architecture in Soviet Lithuania or Soviet architecture in Lithuania? We decided that Lithuania was Sovietized, so it was architecture in Soviet Lithuania. Then we had Architecture Fund talk series, Modernism LT, Influences, Ideologies, Legacies, or in 2010, and Modern Heritages in 2012. Different seminars, for example, one of them was Between Nostalgia and Criticism. How do we look at that socialist modernist heritage in Lithuania? Published proceedings, and again the question of dissidence through architecture was risen by German researcher Ines Weitzman, and difficult discussions were whether it was possible to demonstrate dissidence through architecture. Discussions with other Baltic researchers, and finally discussing this cultural resistance proclaimed by architects themselves and subversive opportunism proposed by researchers was also an interesting flow and development of discussions which were more deep and more complicated with each year. So we can summarize that there was this narrative proposed by architects as cultural resistance, and narrative as or research result as subversive opportunism was also widely discussed. What was the reason? What was the regional approach? If it was not Soviet, so then what was this avoiding the Soviet style? We proposed that this looking Western was imagined, or the strive for international Western modernism, appropriation of Western architectural journals, and copying. The question of copying and appropriation was very sensitively perceived by architects themselves. However, during this period, one important political event happened. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014. And this was a very strong statement that the thing that everybody in my circle or cultural circle was researching is not history. It stopped to be history and started to be the continuation or the presence again. And this symbolic removal of the Stalinist period sculptures from the Green Bridge in Lithuania in 2015 became a very symbolic gesture, because these sculptures were not removed in 1990. immediately after 1990, because they were not considered so important politically, because out of the 4 groups, only one group depicted soldiers of the Soviet army with all their insignias. But after the invasion of Russia into Crimea, immediately they started to be interpreted by the wider public in different view, in different opinion. And these insignias, these soldiers and other depictions that seemed to be history became the present, and they were removed. But how about architecture? Did the attitude change? And we can see what modes of dealing with architecture of socialist modernism were taken starting in the 1990s and continuing through the last 3 decades. And in this research, a very fruitful and very useful theory of David Crowley about the 2 socialist modernisms can help us understand the built environment of socialist modernism and then the destinies of these environments. David Crowley, a famous art historian, proposed to understand that socialist modernism had 2 directions. So Soцmodernism 1, standardized design, cheap and economic, and Soцmodernism 2, individual design. Soцmodernism 1 is defined by technocratic phase of socialist modernism. It takes the form of inexpensive and decorated industrialized building, often for housing, but sometimes for work environments too, such as offices and factories. Ubiquitous and universal, it is usually described in terms of grayness. Whereas Soцmodernism too, virtuoso public buildings designed and constructed in the 60s and 70s, a bravura building that show off their technology, individually designed, unique, customized, etc. Comparing to the Western terminology, we can compare it to the Robert Venturi, Denise Brown, and Steven Izanur's Learning from Las Vegas book, where they do make the distinction between ordinary and ugly versus heroic and original. So we can see almost the same separation. We can see that these buildings, public buildings of socialist modernism too, which were either listed or proudly demonstrated in the booklets about architecture, modernist architecture of Lithuania, indeed continued to be used and reused pragmatically. For example, former Lithuanian Communist Party Central Committee headquarters in Vilnius now houses the Lithuanian government. Former House of the Supreme Soviet of the Lithuanian SSR now serves as a Lithuanian parliament. Former House of Political Education in Vilnius is now the Congress Center and Concert Hall. The Palace of Weddings in Vilnius was renovated in 2019. And it's interesting that a sensitive approach to the former Lutheran cemetery, which was demolished in the 60s because of the construction of this new wedding palace, and it was usually called only as a park without mentioning its former use, now was recreated into a memorial garden in 2020. The Opera and Ballet Theatre in Vilnius by famous Lithuanian female designer Nijolė Bučiūtė was renovated in 2019, especially its urban environment and still remains to be a favorite place for operas and concerts. The Museum of Revolution in Vilnius was rearranged and adapted to the National Gallery of Art after the major reconstruction in 2009. Whereas the former Ministry of Communications was properly restored, which means that it was the first example where conservation architects worked on the building of the late 70s in 2019. But probably the most interesting and sensitive conservation approach was the renovation for the private university of the former Central Post Office by Brother Nasvytis in 2002, which showed that this socialist modernism and this architecture can be nicely adapted for the contemporary use with only several new touches, but not damaging the original material. Even the socialist modernism won when taken simple care of it, can look nice. For example, Vilnius University suburban campus. The student dormitory group, built in 1971, was renovated in 2017 and looks like Bauhaus dormitories, more or less. But in fact, or more popularly, socialist modernism won, the one that was gray and cheap, actually remained either abandoned or demolished or changed extensionally. And I would like to draw your attention on the example of Žirmūnai, a large housing estate in Vilnius, Lithuania, which was built in 1964, was awarded the USSR State Prize in 1968 and listed in 1985. It was the microrayon, one microrayon community with 12,000 residents, built according to standardized design. And as in the community center Žirmūnai, the public art sculpture Joy by Kazys Kysėlis was built in 1970, which was very popular at that time for the modernist public squares. Reconstruction of this community center into the shopping mall of electronic devices occurred already after 1990 with this market economy. In 1995, it was reconstructed with a postmodernist touch. And this new architecture, new function, postmodernist facades can be now interpreted as a simple reaction to socialist uniformity. But you can see that the sculpture is still in its place and the environment is changing. But in 2000s, the shopping mall was closed, the building was not in use, whereas the panel houses were started to be renovated. In 2016, the shopping mall was demolished. But since the community of 12,000 residents needed something for food, some shopping store, the Lidl store came in and built a new Lidl store on the premises. But what was more interesting, that people, also residents of the area, initiated restoration of the sculpture, of course, in a slightly different place and without the basin water pool for the reflection. But now this hybrid space has some mentions, some memories, some modern touches, and we can only ask why did this happen to the place that once was valued, presented as a model and listed, and finally eventually delisted in 2012 because of no value. So reframing values, it's interesting, and in the exercise of interpretation, and we can interpret that probably the heritage value for Žirmūnai was added artificially, and people never treated it as a possible site of heritage, but also of functional everyday life. However, a different story is in Lazdynai, that famous awarded rayon but here we can trace another very interesting change of values from socialist excellence to eco-social values. Architecture is not so important for the residents of Lazdynai, which are still listed as a site, as an urban site, but the greenery, the urban design, the pedestrian paths, and overall functionality is valued more by the residents, and they now want to protect this area and see it as a heritage, but not as an architectural heritage as it was presented before, but as a ecological, from the perspectives of nature and living environment, and social, that it formed in now the third generation of residents. Of course, a lot of demolitions happened, and it is possible to notice that Soviet as a negative attribute depends on the investors' plans and economic pressure. For example, cinema theater Garsas in Panevėžys was demolished in 2021 to make way for the new contemporary art center, but also for the desire of mayor and part of the community to change the environment, to change for the contemporary. Also, an interesting case of demolition which was protested by architects occurred in 2017 because the traffic police administrative building, designed and constructed in 1985 in a postmodernist manner, had to make way for the new office building. And the Vilnius mayor in 2016 said that it is an ugly Soviet monster, and anybody who says that is beautiful is crazy. Then architects, Lithuanian architects made an action. They collected together in front of this building and all said that it is a beautiful building and probably we are all crazy. And there was also another activity that architects were writing letters and postcards to the mayor that this building is beautiful. And also one object exhibition was done that which stated this building is beautiful and this building is beautiful. However, at the same day when the exhibition was opened, the building was demolished and nothing has been built yet on that site. My final case about reframing values is the Vilnius Sports and Concert Hall, built in 1971. And its evolution from the Soviet monster in 2006 to interesting architecture in 2016 and further. So this detailed plan for developing the right bank of the river Neris in Vilnius was already present in the beginning of the 20th century, and we see the first attempts to design and build up more extensively and intensely this area already during the 40s. And then in the Soviet plans to make it into the entire sports complex, because the stadium was already on the spot in the 30s, and Soviets developed the swimming pools and other sports facilities. Finally, in 64, there was entire sports complex was designed with more swimming pools, bicycle track, ice arena, open air swimming pool, and all sports, and the sports hall for 6,000 seats, which could be converted into the concert hall. And after the competition in the Vilnius State Urban Planning Design Institute, the winner was this design, which clearly reminded the international modernism with Eero Saarinen, with Washington Airport, or Stadthalle Wien by Roland Reiner of this decade earlier period. And several designs of this model were also adapted in other cities of Soviet Union. However, Lithuanian designers tried to improve this design, and engineer Karvelis constructed a very special roof construction, which was recognized as an invention. Finally, when it was constructed, it became indeed a very popular place for sports and concerts, and became a landmark of the area. Indeed dominated just in front of the historical old town with the tower, and was very often photographed from a very special angle to demonstrate all its attributes. And it had a very interesting construction of the stage, which could be adapted either to sports or to concerts. And indeed, a lot of important events happened, and starting with the National Liberation Movement, the rock concerts in 87, and the main inaugural meeting of the National Liberation Movement Sąjūdis occurred in October 88. And even after the Soviet tanks invaded Lithuania on January 13, 1991, as a reaction of the Declaration of Independence, a funeral of those victims, of the 13 victims, were also organized in the state funeral and in the same sports and concert hall. However, around 2000 and 2004, it was privatized, and the owner of the private bank, decided that the place is a very good site for development, and invited Massimiliano Fuchsas from Italy, who had Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, to develop the entire site project, the stadium, new Congress Center, 5-star hotels, etc., but also including demolition of the sports hall. However, in 2006, the sports hall was listed on the National List of Cultural Heritage because of architectural and historical values. And different conversion proposals were done in 2009 as a cultural and conference center, then another conference center, and Congress Center for the Lithuanian Presidency at the Council of Europe in 2013. Finally, there was agreement to convert the site into the National Congress Center, and the design proposal was done by Sigitas Kuncevičius Architects in 2019. In 2018, it was the most popular object on the Vilnius Open House Architectural Tours and Events Festival. And you can see the beautiful photographs by Norbert Tukai, that the queues were formed for several hours just to see the building, because it was not in operation already for more than 20 years in 2019. However, during this period, when the discussion and arguments and quarrels about the values of sports hall and its listing, delisting, future use and reuse was happening, somehow people didn't pay enough attention to the fact that it was built on the Jewish cemetery, on the former Jewish Šnipiškių cemetery. And the Jewish community of Lithuania was always raising this question. And if we look back into the photograph that I was showing for you before the site was developed, indeed, we see still the graveyards. And you know that in the Jewish tradition, in the religion, it is not possible to burden and to touch and to change the soil of the cemetery. So finally, there was a big discussion with the international Jewish community and Lithuanian Jewish community and the Lithuanian government that is it possible to find a solution that the listed monument of architecture and the memorial site of former Jewish cemetery, which was very important for the international Jewish community, can cohabit? Is it possible to make? And one of the proposals was done to conserve the building and adapt it to the memorial place for the old Jewish cemetery in Šnipiškių. What is the final decision, and why this case study is important in discussing dissonant heritage? I think it is very important to show how the approach and interpretation towards single object develops and evolves into the entire site, and we start seeing landscape and history in one single site. So this is the end of my talk, and I can only invite you to discuss further all these questions, because we want to... Can you still show my slide? Because there is important information on it. Yeah, we went with this lecture and these questions. I want to invite you to apply for the Arqus Spring School Dissonant Heritage Contested Landscapes and European Identity, which we plan to organize at Vilnius University in June, beginning of June, from 1 to 4th in 2006, next year, as a continuation of this Arqus lecture series of critical heritage. Now we can go back to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marija, for this absolutely fascinating talk. I learned so much, and this was really kind of a time travel, but also a travel through the history of Lithuania in the Soviet context. And also thank you very much for pointing to this summer school that you are organizing in Lithuania as part also of our Living Lab activities. I'm very much looking forward to this, I have to say, after you gave this great introductory talk into the discussions in this post-socialist space. One little kind of transition also within the lecture series, you touched upon this very complex and protracted relationship between Jewish heritage and post-socialist transformation, which is absolutely fascinating. The talk by Philip Graf in December in this lecture series addresses similar questions for the GDR context. So we kind of have a red line here also in that regard already. I will be happy to take up questions in the chat. I hope I can see them. That should be the open chat. So if you, as the audience in this webinar, have questions or comments to make, please post them in the chat. I will be able to read them and to transfer this to Marija. Maybe if that is not yet the case, because you need time to digest all this, the density of information, I would actually misuse my role here as the host of this lecture, because I also would have hundreds of questions coming into my head. And I would maybe like to start with looking back into this history of Lithuanian modernism in the Soviet context, which is really a fascinating story. And I was wondering how you would contextualize Lithuanian modernism in the Soviet Union vis-a-vis other modernisms in the Soviet Union. So I was really intrigued to look at the outcomes of these architectural projects in that regard. I've looked a little bit on Central Asia, and when we look there on the transformation of cities in Soviet Central Asia, that's also very fascinating to see this combination of local heritage and this kind of Sovietization of that heritage. And I was wondering if there was some kind of also exchange between architects across the Soviet Union in those different republics on how to resist Sovietization or how to adapt Sovietization to local contexts.
Yeah, this is an important question that you're posing. And of course, this question belongs to that fruitful decade, I would say, of researching socialist modernism. And in 2012, the Austrian Wien Architekturzentrum in Wien organized a fascinating exhibition, Socialist Modernism in the former Soviet republics without Russia. They didn't want to show the constant examples that were usually presented. Also, it was a post-colonial interpretation of the Soviet Union republics. But yeah, it was, and I would say that in that period, because of this exhibition, also an interesting research community was formed. It was possible indeed to exchange how with the researchers from other former republics. But the Russian invasion in Ukraine stopped it all, and because no, I would say it's not because of no communication. There are communications between researchers, but many archives stopped being available, etc. And on one hand, it was a fruitful decade. We could learn a lot. For example, especially from certain regions like Central Asia, it was very interesting research by Boris Chukovich about Sovietization and Soviet Orientalism, how it was the Central Asian ethno style was invented in Moscow by applying only ornaments, or then we had a lot of interesting material from Caucasus republics like Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, presenting also very interesting movements and processes that were especially in Armenia and in Yerevan, in modernist Yerevan and Tbilisi, and the Baltic republics. Yeah, and because this concept of the Soviet West was conceptualized and formed in Soviet Union, because people could feel more West in the built environment here. And then indeed, we can see that only there was medieval old towns, like the traditional European medieval old towns, a lot of modernist interwar architecture, like Art Deco and all this stuff. And then this modernist architecture of the 60s was, now we can recognize that it was very in harmony with natural environment and small scale, much smaller scale, because the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are small republics, small countries. There's 1 million residents in Estonia, 2 million in Latvia, and 3 million in Lithuania. So everything was small scale, close to nature, adaptations of Western architectural journals. So it was different environment, and it was felt.
Yeah, I think this comparative perspective is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
But when I understand you correctly, you would say there is also research still to be done also about the exchanges between architects in the different Soviet republics.
We did that research, and we found out that the regional exchange was very common. And we can see that Lithuanian architects visited very frequently Estonian architects, and Estonian architects visited or the Baltic summits. But there were very few trips, for example, to Central Asia. Of course, some authorities or ruling elites of the architectural associations had to go to Moscow, etc. But the position of architects themselves was absolute strive towards the West, where we can learn. The self-perception of the professional milieu and professional group was that we cannot learn anything in Soviet Union. We can only, if we want to learn something, we must go only to the Western countries.
Okay. That actually is a perfect bridge to my second question. So this concept of the Soviet West, I find really fascinating. One can really think a lot about how this also reflects back on what is actually the West, not only in the Soviet Union, but for Lithuanian architects. So I was wondering, what was the imaginary of Lithuanian intellectuals and architects in that regard? What kind of West were they having in mind? Also in terms of geographies, but also specifically what they thought they would need to learn.
Yeah, there is a fantastic book I can recommend also for all political scientists or for cultural scientists, researchers of this period. It's edited by Diordi Peteri, The Imagined West. You know it, of course, Steffi. So yeah, it presents this concept of symbolic geographies. So imagine geographies, and I would say that for the Lithuanian architects, it was the Nordic countries. Finland, Sweden, but then United States. In the later period, United States, because there was quite a large emigre community in America, and through relatives and family members, Lithuanian architects received a lot of information about American architecture journals, etc. And so I would say that, but it can really be traced that Finnish architecture was closest to their self-perception, because it can be formulated like this. In Finnish architecture, they saw what they were striving for, because it demonstrated that the combination of being modernist and national or regional at the same could be combined by local materials, respect for the nature, landscape design, what they could see in the modern Finnish architecture, because they produced so many enthusiastic reports about what they have seen.
Yeah. Okay, so the West is not the West
Exactly.
everywhere, right? So I think that's also
yeah.
important for how we think at Arqus about what kind of Europe is actually constructed here. And I think this Nordic dimension is very interesting. Also, when you then move towards the South and the Southwest, also of our alliance, what kind of West is imagined there, and what kind of other to the West is imagined there. Turning an eye to the post-socialist transformation, I find it really fascinating, the different strategies that you mapped from demolition to reframing and reappropriation. I was wondering if you could say more about the actors that are involved here. You already mentioned how much the architects themselves, but also residents as well as investors. I was wondering in which way it's not only a Lithuanian group of people engaging in it, but if there's also transnational dimension to it. So specifically when you mention this regional context in the Baltic states, but also vis-a-vis Finland, if it's also kind of an international project of either demolishing or reframing Lithuanian or Soviet modernism in Lithuania.
Yeah, it is very important to know who is the commissioner and who's the owner and who is interested in one. Of course, developers is the very, very powerful force, and sometimes they are only interested in the site, not the building itself. So building values are not values for them, but the site in the city center with all the communications is, of course, considered more valuable than architecture. Also, when the owner of the state buildings are still government, you can see that they are very properly adapted, nothing posh, but they continue to use those buildings with no problem. With the mass housing areas, it is the changing perception. Some are still despised and some are starting to be, as I showed in Lazdynai, valued again, but because of other reasons, because they are not densely built, they have a lot of greenery, lots of parks, and lots of social, comfortable social infrastructure. And but it happens for sometimes on special occasions. During the probably everybody is familiar with this HBO series Chernobyl. And Chernobyl, the Pripyat was filmed in one of the mass housing districts in Vilnius. And of course, after this, the comments in the public media came, oh, if the filmmakers can still film Soviet Union in our Vilnius, and so it means we didn't change through the 30 years, or do we still want to look like this, etc. So it happens. It happens, of course. And but yes, you mentioned and you noticed correctly that it's a great variety of approaches and great variety of practices. And what I have noticed, because I participated in many events that I showed you, I can feel the changing approaches. And what's interesting about the sports hall, which was my last case, it hasn't been used for 25 years now. And very recently we were talking with our students that probably the best use for it could be the concrete ruins. Let the nature take it back somehow, because if people didn't agree on the use of this building for so many years, so maybe they don't need it, and we don't have to be so tied to this 2006 concept that we need to preserve it, list it, and preserve it. Of course, it's important for a very large part of society, of Vilnius community, but it's equally important for the local Jewish community and international Jewish community. So it's very layered, very dissonant.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and also that you mentioned the younger generation. I was also wondering in which way that is also a question of generation. Indeed, these discussions about how to deal with that heritage, how to contextualize this in current Lithuanian debates about Lithuania's position in Europe, Lithuania's position vis-a-vis Russia, in which way younger generations are about losing interest or presenting completely different imaginaries for it. I asked this also against the background of what one can observe in Western countries that had not been part of the socialist camp, for which socialist imaginaries, socialist fashion, socialist architecture takes on a new kind of, in the context of a consumer culture, gets a new meaning and a new popularity. So this kind of interest in this anti-capitalist kind of landscapes. And I was
But
wondering how you would
but sorry, I will react very quickly with one very interesting paper, which was written and produced as a position paper by very well-known architectural historian Vladimir Kulic, who is of the former Yugoslav origin, working for many years in the United States. He called this paper "Orientalizing Socialism." Like being some exotic other where you can, for retro, for vintage, for something like the styles, but you are mentioning a little bit different approach, anti-capitalist planning and approach. Yeah, this happens, but I see that it is more like visually, exotically perceived more often.
And you would say that is also true for the young generations in Lithuania, or do they have a different approach to these sites?
Depends, but they are not that probably not anymore so sensitive to its communist past.
Yeah. So they might have a more liberal take on it and be more creative, as this example of let nature take it also demonstrates. I think that's also a nice linkage to another thematic pillar in our Living Lab on climate change. So how does climate change also impact the ways in which we look at heritage? So the destruction and the reframing of heritage through nature and climate events also, I think, can be an interesting avenue to further study. I don't see questions in the chat now, which might also be due to the late hour of this talk. Nevertheless, I hope for those who watch this video online later on YouTube will enjoy as much as I did Marija's lecture and hopefully also take inspiration from it to think about these kind of topics in your own disciplinary context or for future research. So since we are at the end of the 90 minutes, so we're landed punctually on time, I would like to thank Marija very much for this wonderful talk and for this wonderful opening of that lecture series, and invite everybody to join us to continue following this lecture series. We will continue on the 11th of December with a talk by Juan Manuel Barrios from Granada University on landscape and heritage, the siege of the Alhambra for speculation and tourism, which wonderfully connects to these questions of how this post-socialist heritage is appropriated also by financial interests and not only by cultural and political debates. So therefore, we continue this discussion in mid-December. So thanks a lot for joining and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.